Welcome to the recording of the webinar, Prevention in the Elderly. What should we know, especially on vaccinations? The presenter is Dr. Tom Axelrod and the webinar is hosted by Dr. Ferdinando Petrazzulli. This webinar was recorded on the 27th of July 2023.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Ferdinando Petrazzulli, and I am a member of the Wonka Europe Executive Board. It is a pleasure for me to introduce you the speaker of this evening webinar, Dr. Tom Axelrod, active family doctor from the Clalit Healthcare Services at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. Please, Tom, you can start your presentation. The title of his presentation is Prevention in the Elderly with a special focus on vaccination.
Hi, thank you, Ferdinando and Burak, for inviting me. And also thanks for Professor Shlomo Winker, also from Israel, who asked me to make this talk today. So as Ferdinando say, my name is Tom Axelrod. I'm a family physician from Israel. I work in two peripheral clinics near Jerusalem, and I'm also teach at the Faculty of Medicine in the Hebrew University. And today I would like to talk about an issue that I think many of us find very important and challenging: prevention in the elderly people. What should we know, and especially about vaccinations? Why prevention in the elderly is so special? Why should we talk about prevention in other population? Well, we could do that, but maybe in the elderly is more important. And I would like to show you why I think that. If we look at the population around the world, with the World Population Prospect 2022 by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations, we can see that today, here it said, it's written 2022, the world is around 8 billion people, and the approximation is that it should be in 2030 8.5, and in the 2050 it should reach to almost 10 billion people. And who are those people? So we see here in the lower graph that the life expectancy at birth is rising from year, and they're projecting that it's going to raise a little bit more in the two future decades. I think I can have this one, an annotation from Zoom. Okay, anyway, so here at the front of this this report, they put a young girl that looks at the future. But I want to claim that they should put an older woman, an elderly woman, looking and thinking what's going to be. And because of what? Because we see that the growth rate of the population, which are 65 years and over, is going to raise. And if we said that before, the population should be 10 billion, so the percentage of people above the age of 65, if today it's around 10%, in 2 decades, it will be 16.4% all over the world. But in Europe and North America and also in Israel, it's going to be more than 20 and 25%. So more than a quarter of the population is going to be above the age of 65. And not just that, we know that every group of age are raising, but if you see this pyramid, this is data from Israel, but it's true for all Europe and North America. The growth rate for people above the age of 70 is the highest, is the fastest. So people that today they're going to be in the 2 decades in the future at the age of 70, this portion of population is going to raise at the fastest way. And that's why I would like to talk about the prevention. And Shlomo asked me to make an emphasis on the vaccination. That's what I'm going to do. We're going to go over the 5 vaccinations that are recommended for elderly people. Elderly is defined by 60, 65 and above. And later summarize the other screening and action that we should think about when we treat people above the age of 65. So we have basically 5 vaccinations: the COVID-19, the seasonal flu vaccination, the tetanus, which is DTaP, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis vaccination, and 2 new vaccinations, which I'm going to talk about, especially the zoster recombinant vaccination, the Shingrix, and the pneumococcal vaccination, which we have in recent years. We had the polysaccharide 23, but now we have the Prevenar, the conjugated vaccination, PCV 20. So let's begin with pneumococcal infections. Why it's so important to be vaccinated against pneumococcal infections? Because pneumococcal infections can cause two kinds of diseases: invasive pneumococcal invasions, which is bacteremia or meningitis, or you see here maybe pneumonia, which with bacteremia, but most of the pneumonias are not invasive. They are not the bacteria, the streptococcal pneumonia is not entering to the bloodstream, stays and make a local inflammation, lobar inflammation in the lung, and that is called non-invasive. And also it can cause acute otitis media or sinusitis. These diseases can cause hospitalizations and long recovery, and sometimes even mortality. And of course, more susceptible are the immunosuppressant population and the elderly population. And here, when you see beautiful slides, it's from Pfizer. And when you see ugly slides, it's my slides. So here you can see that the non-invasive pneumococcal pneumonia is most of the disease, most of the cases. And the more serious cases are the invasive pneumonia disease. So we have 2 kinds of vaccinations in general that are approved by the FDA: a polysaccharide vaccine and a conjugated vaccine. The polysaccharide vaccine considered less effective, a little bit less effective, because it just activates the B cells, and by that gives to the immune system immunoglobulins. But the conjugated vaccine, not that it has the B cell activation, it also has the T cell effect, because we conjugate another protein that classically take from diphtheria, for example. It's inactivated, of course, there's no risk. And by that, we can cheat the immune system and to active also a T cell reaction. And the T cell reaction cause, in its turn, a memory B cells. So if the patient have a conjugate vaccine and after a few years meet again the bacteria, then the body remembers it and can produce another amount of immunoglobulins. So we used to have the Pneumovax 23 for 23 subtypes of pneumococci, and which evidence do we have about its efficacy? So we have a Cochrane review that concluded that this meta-analysis provided evidence support that recommendation for PPV, that the Pneumovax 23, to prevent invasive pneumococcal disease in adults, but not a compelling evidence for all-cause pneumonia or mortality. So we can prevent by that only invasive pneumococcal disease. And in the New England, in the 2013, it published the CAPITA trial by Pfizer. CAPITA trial was a randomized control trial because this Cochrane was not about, it didn't conclude the randomized control trial, also only a retrospective cohorts. But this is a randomized control trial, double-blind placebo control, about more than 80,000 participants, age 65 and above, that were followed up for 4 years. And they were given, half of them, around 40,000 were given placebo, and the other 40 was given a Prevnar 13. So conjugated vaccine with only 13 subtypes. And here I summed up the results. If we can see here in the table, community-acquired pneumonia, vaccine type strain, that means pneumonia that was caused by the one of the 13 vaccine types. There were 66 episodes in the intervention group and 106 in the placebo. And in the article, they calculated it to the efficacy of 37 with a significant p-value. And I calculated number needed to vaccinate 1,057. That's to say that we should vaccinate a little bit more than 1,000 people in order to prevent one patient of having a community-acquired pneumonia from the type that the vaccine contained. Not mortality, not hospitalization. What about community-acquired pneumonia against any pneumococcal? Because the theoretical idea was that if I give the vaccination the vaccination contained certain amount, in this case 13 types, but maybe there is a little cross immunization, it can protect against other pneumococcal, and we see that no, community-acquired pneumonia against any cause is not effective, and against any pneumococcal, here you see the difference, 135 and 174. These are around 40 cases. It's the same 40 cases as the community-acquired pneumonia from the vaccine type strain. So anyway, we know that the vaccine protects from the almost 100%, just for the types that it was contained, not other types. And the efficacy is here, if you calculate the efficacy, it looks high, 37%, but the number needed to vaccinate is higher, and it gives us the perspective of how many we need to vaccinate. What about death? So death from community-acquired pneumonia, you see here, it's not effective at all. So to sum up, the vaccination against pneumococcal disease can protect us from, especially from the invasive, pneumococcal diseases, but also a little bit for the non-invasive pneumococcal disease, which basically are pneumococcus, pneumonia, and sometimes meningitis or acute otitis media or sinusitis. Here we can see that in the bottom, the polysaccharide, the Pneumovax 23, these are the different pneumococcal types, and you can see how much from it does the new Prevnar 20 contains. So there's almost a complete overlap, and the Prevnar 20 serotypes today is the gold standard because it contains almost all of the serotypes. The last four serotypes are not very violent, so it's not really important. And so, and of course, it has the advantages of being a conjugated vaccine. So today, the recommendation is to use the Prevnar 20 vaccine, and here you see in the chart that it's recommended PCV20 or PCV23, and there are places which they have PCV15. And what's the routine, what's the schedule? So if your patient is not vaccinated at all, and you should give him 1 dose of Prevnar 20, or if you have in your country Prevnar 15, so the recommendation is to combine Prevnar 15, and after a few weeks, the Pneumovax 23. If the patient was already vaccinated with Pneumovax 23, the polysaccharide, or by the Prevnar, the conjugated 13, so you wait a year and only then vaccinate with the new Prevnar 20. And if he was already vaccinated with both of Prevnar 13 and the polysaccharide Pneumovax 23, then he should wait 5 years. That's the formal recommendation. Here in Israel, we changed these 5 years into 1 year. The Ministry of Health in Israel thought that it's enough to wait 1 year, and it's safer enough to vaccinate again in the new vaccine. Next, we talk about varicella zoster that in the childhood cause chickenpox and then stays sleep in the body, in the dorsal root ganglia, and reactivate later in life. It can be at any age, but again, it's more common in people above the age of 50 and in immunosuppressant. And here in the picture, you can see what you are familiar and recognize immediately these shingles. What we are trying to prevent in the vaccination is not only the disease itself, the shingles, but also the most important complication, which is post-herpetic neuralgia, that can stay and debilitate the person for even months and even more than a year. And I think any GP saw this at older people, that they have post-herpetic neuralgia, and it's getting them miserable for even more than a year, preventing them to do daily activities, sports, and it has many effects on the health. So what evidence do we have about this vaccination in patients above the age of 70? So we have a very good 2 RCTs. I'm going to present you one of them. The first one was on patients at 50 years and above, and I'm going to present now the RCT that was done at the same population in 18 countries all over Europe, the States, Australia, and on a little bit more than 14 participants, age 70 or more, and the follow-up period was 3.7. It was funded by GSK because they produced the the new recombinant vaccination, Shingrix. Before Shingrix, we had not a recombinant, which is a deadly vaccination, not deadly, but it used the not alive virus. Before the Shingrix, we had an attenuated live vaccination called Zostavax, and it has two disadvantages. First, it was less efficacious, and the second one, you couldn't vaccinate immunosuppressant people. This and the new one, Shingrix, which we have around 10 years now. You can, as you will see in a minute, it's very efficacious and it's safer, much safer, and you can give it even to younger people with if they have immunosuppressant from any cause, biological medications, HIV infections, autoimmune diseases. That's the recommendation for everyone to get this Shingrix. So if we look at the risk of developing herpes zoster after vaccination, follow-up was a little bit less than 4 years. We see here that those in green that had what here it's written HZ/SU, that's the Shingrix, the zoster recombinant virus vaccination. We see that significantly less people had the disease, and the number needed to vaccinate is around 35, and the vaccine efficacy is around 90%. If we look at the complication, the postherpetic neuralgia after vaccination, we see again number needed to vaccinate a little bit higher, 165. It's still very good number needed to treat or number needed to vaccinate. And you can see the efficacy is 88%. And in general, it's one of the most, I think, safer and efficacious vaccine that we have today. And here you can see at the chart, the recommendation is to use zoster recombinant. Recommendation at the age of above 50, 2 doses, they're separated. They should be separated between 4 and 6 months from each other. The minimum is 1 month, but it's better to wait a little bit more. And that's about the Shingrix. So we talked about the pneumococcal and the varicella, and we move to influenza, which is more complicated regarding evidence. In general, you all know the recommendation is very strict. After the age of 65, every season, every year, between September and October, or maybe September and November, anyone should get a flu vaccination. The recommendation is to use the high-dose inactivated flu vaccine. There are a few more recombinant influenza vaccine. There are a few researchers that compared one to each other, and there are no differences. It really doesn't matter. What matters the most is that it should be quadrivalent and a recombinant. That means not the attenuated. The live attenuated is for children, it's through nasal spray, and this for another lecture. So all other people which are not children should get, especially a patient, a pregnant patient and the elderly patient should get the high-dose inactivated influenza vaccine. It contains it used to contain 3 types, but now in recent years, it contains 4 types, 2 influenza A and 2 influenza B. Influenza were classically H1N1 and H3N2. many words were written about the efficacy of the vaccination, especially in the elderly. Does it prevent death or only hospitalization or just flu disease? So here we have in the New England a nice retrospective cohort about the effectiveness of influenza vaccine in a community dwelling elderly. The average age in this research was 75. And you see here data were put from 18 cohort of community dwelling elderly member of HMOs during the 90s. And the results, there were more than 700 person season of observation. Most high-risk medical conditions that were measured were more prevalent among vaccination and then other vaccination. Vaccination was associated with a 27% reduction in the risk of hospitalization from pneumonia or influenza, score significant, the odds ratio, and 48% reduction in the risk of death, also odds ratio significant. This sounds very good, but we should remember it is a retrospective cohort study, and we have RCT. We have only a few very old RCTs. One or two of them are from the early 2000s, and the other from the 90s and the 80s. And the most updated Cochrane we have on this issue contains 8 RCTs for flu vaccination for the elderly age 65 and above, over 5,000 participants, and they found much modest results. Low risk of influenza from 6% to 2.4%, and ELI, that's the influenza-like illness, influenza-like disease, from 6% to 35%. They found that there was no effect on mortality, and the RCTs didn't have enough data on hospitalization or pneumonia. Here you can see this false plot that mortality was not affected at all by when they combined. Actually, it's not combination, it's only one RCT that didn't show any mortality effect from a flu vaccine in the elderly. Here, that was a cherry picking. I took only the outcomes from the Cochrane review of influenza and influenza-like illness. And here you can see that was yes, it was significantly reduced. Not the hospitalization, but the disease itself. The number needed to vaccinate is 42 and 29, which is very good, but it's much modest than what we have seen in the New England paper. So it's still reasonable to recommend the influenza vaccine, even if it's not prevent death or hospitalization. We don't really sure about it, but for sure it can prevent a disease. And here we can see that the recommendation of the CDC is to have one of the 4, the quadrivalent recombinant, 1 dose annually. Best to have it between September and October. Next one is COVID-19. COVID-19, you all know about it. It's still here, and although, let's say, at least in Israel, but in many other Western countries, most of population are vaccinated. And today, still the Omicron is the controlling type. It's not violent as was the Delta, and hence the most susceptible is today is not 40 people who are 40 and 50 that were susceptible to the Delta, but today with the Omicron we reduce we can reduce the recommendation to say, especially those who are 65 and above should have the vaccination. Here you see that people who are immunocompetent at the age of 20, the formal recommendation is anyone above the age of 12, but especially those who are 65 and above should get the vaccination. And here today we have the bivalent, which contains the Delta, the original strand as the monovalent, and also two serotypes of the Omicron, the BA 5.1 and 0.2. So this said that if you have a patient which is unvaccinated at all, he should get one dose from the bivalent. It doesn't matter if it's Moderna or Pfizer, and if he's what is called partially vaccinated, had before only one monovalent, he should complete the bivalent, and if he had before he or she had before the monovalent and one of the bivalent vaccination, then the patient considered completely vaccinated. And then the question is, who should we booster? So this is what I said now, just the Moderna and the Pfizer. And who should be booster is not strictly recommended now. We're still waiting for a formal decision. It's common sense to recommend once a year, but I'm not sure it's really effective. And I'm not getting now into the many details. There are very complicated work that researchers and try to calculate if it's efficacious to boost after 1 year or after 2 years. The number needed to vaccinate, anyways, it's beyond 1 or 2,000. So apparently it's not very efficacious, but we should wait for the formal recommendation. Here you can see COVID-19, you should get 2 to 3 primary series and booster. Okay, so besides, what other vaccination do we have? Now we have counted the 4 main vaccinations, the pneumococcal infections, the varicella zoster, the COVID-19, and the influenza. And there is another recommendation to have the DTaP, especially for the tetanus, every 10 years. And also for, until now, we've talked about only people that, although they are 65 and above, they're still in an average risk. They're not in high risk. People which are in a high risk should have the hepatitis A and B vaccination if they didn't have it before, and if they travel to endemic places or they have CSF leak, they should have the meningococcal 2 vaccination, ACWY, and also the Bexsero or the Menintrix, the meningococcal B, and the Haemophilus influenza type B, and also the MMR. MMR, very, very little patients really need it. Most of them were born before 1957. They're considered to be infected already. And if not above the age of 65, only if someone is part of a healthcare team, a physician, a nurse, and there were no documentation of that he or she had infected or vaccinated before in MMR, the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccination, then you can vaccinate him. So this is about the vaccination, and I'm considered to go over now the other very, very shortly. Maybe I'll try to do it in 5 or 10 minutes. What other screening tests are recommended for adults at the age of 65 and above. And this is based mainly on the US Preventive Service Task Force. I'm going to show you now three last slides, which I summed up all the screening recommendation. There, as I said, based mainly on the US Preventive Service Task Force and partly on the Israeli Preventive Service Task Force that I was one of the editors here in Israel. Most of these recommendations have a grade B evidence. Grade A is only if you have a randomized control trial. Grade B, it's evidence that came from observational studies, and unless I indicate otherwise, it's grade B. And from time to time, you will see that I indicate grade D, which says not to do, or grade C, which are the evidence was taken from expert opinions or retrospective studies. So, screening for adults. What should we think when we have a meeting with 65 or older person? Regarding historical information and consultation. So still, like any age, vaccinations are nice to have, screening tests are nice to have, but the most important thing is to preserve a healthy lifestyles with an emphasis of exercise. And we talk about between 3 to 5 times per week, aerobic exercise for me, for you, for everyone, even for the older, even for patients above the age of 80. And we talk about 3 main categories: weight training or resistant exercise, flexibility, and balance training. It's very important for everyone. And if you do this, it will improve patients' health or improve your health more than any vaccination in the world. Alcohol use, we use the CAGE questionnaire, and of course, counseling to stop. Tobacco use, we, again, where we can, we regularly assess and consult to stop, and sometimes use pharmacotherapy. Medication use, especially with the polypharmacy patients, we should go over regularly, every 1 or 2 visits, look for all the medications, see that they have the correct indication, that they don't use too many benzodiazepine or anticholinergic, that there are adhere, and that we have the accurate dosage, and that it is also affordable by the patients, and there are no interactions. Urinary incontinence, sometimes we tend to forget about it, but it's very important to inquire about that and to treat if it's necessary. Driving, especially with patients with dementia or those who have a cognitive impairment, and social support, elder mistreated, to look if there are any neglect or abuse. And even though it takes time, advanced directives, which is end-of-life decisions, very important, worth asking for the patient to schedule another visit to talk only about this end-of-life decision. Even if he's not near end of life, even if he's only 60 or 70 and still have maybe 20, 25 years, it's never early. It's never early to discuss about this with other maybe relatives in the family. Physical examination and testing. So blood pressure and BMI, if the patient was not diagnosed before with hypertension or with overweight or obesity, we measure his or her BMI and blood pressure annually, every year. Lipids, that was by the Preventive Task Force, and I think very justifiable, limited until the age of 75. Every 5 years. I know many of us, and I also sometimes tend to take a blood test every year, but I'm not sure that's necessary. That may be an overdiagnosis. But the minimum is every 5 years if the patient was not diagnosed before with a hyperlipidemia, and we treat if there is a 10-year risk of a cardiovascular risk above 10%. Diabetes, again, we shouldn't take fasting glucose for every patient every year until the age of 70. The formal recommendation is to have it every 3 years, only if the patient have any other risk factors like hypertension, hyperlipidemia, or overweight. So if you have patients that reach the age of 80 and he was not diagnosed with diabetes before, and especially if he or she doesn't have any risk factors, I don't see any reason to measure his fasting glucose. If we diagnose impaired fasting glucose at the age of 90, so what? Hearing and vision, again, annual screening, gait and balance, that's still related. We have the gait up and go test, get up and go test. Oh, sorry. Also, very important to assess cognition and mood. Cognition we assess not regularly, only if patient is complaining about memory loss or that we see any functional impairment. We can use the standardized test like the Mini-Cog, the Mini-Mental, the MoCA, etc. Mood, we can use two standardized, two validated questions, the PHQ-2, and we can ask patients that during the last month, have you been bothered by feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? Or have you been bothered by having a little interest or pleasure in doing things? And last slide, cancer screening and other tests. Bone density indicated for women at the age of 65 and older. I know in many places they do also for men or for women from the age of 60 or 50 or 55. I'm not going deep into any, for every recommendation here, there is a full world of evidence, but you should believe me now that the Youth Preventive Task Force is really keeping us from overdiagnosed people, and women, healthy women, asymptomatic women before the age of 65 shouldn't be examined for osteoporosis, only at the age of 65 and older. Abdominal aortic aneurysm for men who have a history of smoking once in a lifetime between the age of 65 and 75. Simple ultrasonography of the abdomen. Breast cancer, biennial, that means that means every 2 years mammography until the age of 74. Classically, we recommended for an average risk woman from the age of 50. Now the Youth Preventive Task Force want to lower it to the age of 40. I'm not sure it's justifiable, but we don't talk about it now. Just to say the limitation is 74 or 75 if you want, and if every 2 years mammography and not physical examination. Actually, it's a very interesting, maybe it's a question part to hear from you. If you in your country, physician recommend or do a physical breast examination as a screening, not as as part of the physical examination when women come with a complaint, but as a screening in Israel, I can tell you there are physicians who recommend wrongly to do the physical examination, and we have a great deal of discussion about this with them, because it's only mammography that was had any efficacy evidence. Prostate cancer, in general, not recommended to take annually PSA, but the Youth Preventing Task Force put grade C. It's debatable for men between the age of 55 and 69, but men above the age of 70, there are no evidence, and it is no comment, there are no evidence that it's lower the risk of mortality, of all-cause mortality and or mortality from cancer. Colorectal cancer may be the only one that gained the grade A, occult blood stool annually or colonoscopy every 10 years until the age of 75. Cervical, that means a pap smear, and now the high resolution HPV testing every 3 to 5 years from the age of 25, actually, until the age of 65. So if a woman didn't do at all its common sense at the age of 65, or if she comes to you at the age of 70 or 80 and she didn't do anytime this test, it's common sense to have it once, but if she did it before, there is no indication to continue doing a pap smear and a high resolution HPV for cervical cancer screening above the age of 65. And last, lung cancer, low dose CT only for smokers at the age of 50 or 80 years who have a 20-pack year smoking history, or if they quit smoking in the past 15 years. So that was to say that we should make a great deal of thinking when we treat patients 75, and we should consult them and to recommend accurately about examination and tests and vaccination in order to keep their health, because they are the future. They're going to be most of the population that are growing, and we will be above 65 sooner or later. So we should take care of those people. And with this optimal message, I'll end and open the discussion for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Axelrod, for your very interesting presentation. Now we have some questions from the audience. I have this one from Dr. Grabinar. He said, I most get questioned about the risk of the side effects from the vaccines. The concept of relative risk, disease versus side effect, is very hard to explain to lay people. Any comments? So what is your...
Again, can you ask again the question? It's very hard to explain what?
The relative risk, just to tell maybe the patients the risk of the side effects, expressing this as a relative risk could not be the best way to fight the hesitancy of patients towards vaccination.
Yes, yes. So you're right. We shouldn't talk with patients about in terms of relative risk, because it's a very difficult. The probabilistic terms are very difficult to understand, even for us as physician. So I think the number needed to vaccinate, or the number needed to treat, or the number needed to harm are more easy to understand terms. So what I use with patients, I can tell them that, for example, they should get the Shingrix vaccine, because we know that for every 20 or 30 or 40 patients that had the vaccine, we can prevent one from having the disease or from having any complication. And that's very easy to understand. And if they ask about the complication, let's say about myocarditis from COVID-19, I can weigh the risk of have myocarditis or pericarditis from the COVID-19 disease or from COVID-19 vaccination. And I can easily say that the risk of having the pericarditis from the disease is higher than from the vaccination. So this here I didn't use any numerical terms, just higher or lower. And if I have the number in front of me and I know what's the number needed to harm, I can say for every 1,000 people or for every million people who have a flu vaccination, one is having this very rare syndrome called Guillain-Barré. So if you say numbers like for every million patients, they have something, it gives the message of it's very rare.
Okay, I just want to invite the audience to ask questions using the facility, the questions and answer facility of Zoom. I have a question myself, a comment more than a question. Don't you think that instead of just give numbers to the patients, the role model of GP is very important? If we tell patients, okay, I have received this vaccination myself, or I recommend this to my father, my mother, can be more effective in convincing patients and fighting the hesitancy. As a family doctor, we have this, let's say, tool, very strong tool that tend to maybe to underestimate that we can convince patients, not just using figures, but example.
Yes,
like,
it's a great comment, because you're very right. And one of the, I think every physician should be a role model, but I think family physician and in general primary care team, nurses, and even the secretaries should be role model, because we are the most close to the patient. We see them much, and we know them and their families. And you're right, when we say that we had the vaccination by ourselves or recommended it, and even if we stick to a healthy lifestyle, if we eat well, if we do physical exercise, and we tell them, and I tell my patients a lot, listen, even I doing weightlifting a little bit to be, not that I'm a bodybuilder, but I think it's important to have strength training. And yes, even if you're my patient and you're at the age of 80, I recommend to you to do this as well. It's good for the flexibility, it's good for the equilibrium. And I think role modeling is very important. And it was also shown by a few trials that it's when it comes from the primary care physician, then the recommendation is more efficacious.
Okay, thank you. I liked your way of presenting the screening in the elderly. Your approach is to, if I understand well, is to avoid over-investigation, over-diagnosis, and over-prescription, because in a way, when you are 65 and you do a lot of if you do a lot of unnecessary investigation, the risk is that you find a lot of disease at the very early stage with the results is over-prescription and a lot of investigation, etc., etc. And what do you think? We should avoid an over-investigation in the elderly to avoid this over-prescription, etc., etc.
Yes, I think this issue is maybe one of the most complicated issue today in modern medicine, because let's say above the age of 50, the the risk for diseases is rising, and above the age of 55 and 60, also the risk for cancer is growing. And still we have lack of evidence, which is for what screening is very effective, and there is much risk about overdiagnosis. Even if we stick to those formal recommendations, part of what we are doing will include always some overdiagnosis and overtreatment, general overdoing. And actually, I think it would be the best if we had evidence that would separate the population, one group between the age of 65 and 75, and the other group 75 and above, because we also don't want to miss diseases, and we do want to find to have early detection of diseases, especially at the age of between 65 and 75, which can be sometimes prevented. So I think we should, from one side, stick to the evidence and don't order screening tests at the older ages if they're not indicated, but instead listen very carefully to patients, because in many cases, patients come with a complaint which they not really know how to say it. And if we listen to them and take good anamnesis, good medical history, and if we physically examine them when they come, then we can, let's say, case find, and we can order tests only for those patients who are that they really deserve to have, and not for the complete population without any strict indication.
Thank you. I have a question also on the vaccine for pneumococcal infection. It seems that in this case, the efficacy of these vaccines are a bit lower than those from the flu, those for the shingles, for the zoster. Yeah. And also it's a bit complicated. Maybe the real problem is that the vaccine were produced 5 years ago or 10 years ago did not cover all the serotype. For example, I have a lot of people who are vaccinated with the Prevnar 13, and now, but so there are many other virus that not virus, sorry, bacteria that are not covered with this vaccine. So, what is your suggestion? You presented something that maybe after 1 year we should try to
revaccinate with the
revaccinated. Can you repeat this concept? These are very important.
Yes, I think it's a good question because the vaccination, and also with the Prevnar 20, I'm not sure it's going to be. Still, we don't have a randomized controlled trial for the Prevnar 20. The only evidence of the efficacy of the Prevnar 20 is just laboratory diseases that show that the immune system reacts and we gain immunity, but that's very nice. But these are laboratory data, and we don't have data about the prevention of the efficacy to prevent hospitalization or diseases, or even mortality. So I think one of the reasons that the pneumococcal vaccination are not so efficacious is because pneumococcus is one of the most violent bacteria more than COVID-19 and more than flu, and you know, even the simple group A streptococcus that we have in the throat that can cause tonsillitis. If we put
Tom is disconnected. Okay, but I think that almost we have finished this webinar. Unfortunately, there is this technical issue. I don't know if we can have back Tom in the webinar. Actually, I thought it was myself that it was disconnected. That's why I accidentally. Let's see if, okay, Tom is disconnected. No. Okay, I think it's almost 7 o'clock, so we can also consider finished this webinar. Thank you very much for being so attentive. And okay, there were some questions about the vaccination for shingles. A colleague from, I think from North Macedonia, asked if this vaccination is mandatory. It's not. As far as I know, it's not mandatory, but it's highly advised, suggested, and it's free of charge in many European countries. In Italy, for example, it is free. There are the two kinds of vaccine, the Zostavax and the Shingrix, but it's free of charge. It's not mandatory, of course. It's not one of those. For example, in the only a few people are eligible for having this vaccination for free. I think that we should stop here, also because we have run out of time. And thank you very much for being so attentive. Thank you.